I'm pleased to announce that this video is brought to you by Means TV. Means TV is a home to all sorts of video makers, creators, and filmmakers that are dedicated to liberation, decolonization, and so many other things that I stand by as someone that tries to speak honestly online about the political reality that we live under. So if you want to learn more about Means TV, stay tuned for the end of this video to learn more and figure out how you can sign up and help this channel and Means TV. I think beyond the hoopla of who you're voting for and what candidate you support, there is the more serious question of what political actions are we taking in our lives that produce meaning, that produce reality, that produce truth. A moment in my life that really defined so many of the current politics that I have. It was back in about October or November of 2014, which is wild to think that that was literally 10 years ago. And it was my senior year of college. It was fall semester. And I remember getting to campus and learning about the murder of Michael Brown and participating in this small walkout, eventually going to Ferguson, visiting where people were doing movement work after Michael Brown was killed, marching with people, doing my first march in the evening, understanding that there was the threat of police, feeling so angry and feeling like I deserved to be there. And I remember going to these protests in Ferguson for a few days, coming back to my campus and organizing heavily around racial justice. And I feel like this was the first time in my life where I felt like what is happening politically is so tied to my life and my reality that I can't not act, especially as someone who is new into adulthood. And I started organizing marches and rallies and doing talks on my campus. And then the announcement came that the police officer that killed Michael Brown, the news of his sentencing would come out, and I gathered with a bunch of my friends on College Green. We sat around a megaphone and put our phone next to it so you could hear it on speaker. And the announcement was made that the cop that killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, was found not guilty, that he would not be punished for the crime that he had committed. There would not be this form of justice for this Black boy. And my chest started feeling tight. It was hard to breathe. I felt like I needed to sit down or maybe leave the area where people were. And I remember going by this tree and I broke down crying. And I don't even know what was going through my mind, but it was this wave of grief, this wave of anger, this wave of disappointment in the system that I'd been born into and was living under, and now newly realized could kill someone like me or not like me, and there wouldn't be any justice. My parents could be on a news stage, crying, screaming, being upset, being calm about it. And what would that produce other than the grief that I was experiencing? And I remember crying, and this big light came onto me, and it was a student journalist being like, how do you feel about the fact that Michael Brown was killed? And I was so upset, disoriented, confused, angry. And luckily my white friend came over and was like, get the fuck out of his face. And I remember hearing chants, and my friend looked at me and he said, people are marching to the student center, and I can stay here with you, but it might be good for you to see this through, to follow on, to continue with the march. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like something that I had experienced politically, something that my people had experienced politically, I had an exact course of action to protest, to continue to express my dissent. Me and other students went to the student center, occupied it for a number of hours, yelled at administration, and that began my organizing journey. Literally, that moment 10 years ago began my organizing journey. In this discussion of anti-voting and electoralism, I'm not here to shame any of the history of why Black people especially have fought for voting rights. I'm not here to shame people that are fearful of Trump or part of 2025. I'm here to ask very deep questions around what meaning is our political system offering us through the act of voting? What illusions are built into the process of voting that don't allow us to express and enact a justifiable grief or rage? This year alone, we've watched atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. We've been privy to disinformation after disinformation after disinformation. We've been asked to vote for ourselves or vote for other people that are like us in this country or vote for people that have less than us in this country. I think when we tap into our anger and our grief at all of these things that have happened, we would reach for more deep, conscious, and meaningful political action. And this isn't to say that the way that we're all operating now politically is a farce, it's false. But I do think there are foundational myths around the act of voting, like the Electoral College. There are various forms of voter suppression and disinformation and disenfranchisement that are a continuation of these racialized illusions and compromises that were made to denigrate certain populations of people when the Electoral College and other forms of voting systems in the US were established. It's really, really important to ground ourselves in the need to access this historical grief and access this historical rage to understand how we should consciously and militantly react to what is happening right now. And so I hope this video is a guide for folks that are interested in that. Last night, I got back to Ohio. I had a really great weekend. I was laying down watching the news, and I saw that the IOF had just bombed another part of Gaza. They bombed outside of a hospital, bombed numerous tents where people that were recovering. And there are numerous videos online of this fire, the tents on fire, bodies in the fire. All I can really say to that video and all of the other atrocities happening, the fact that cop cities are being built around the country, that climate change is ravaging even more parts of our world in different parts of the US, that people are still being killed by police, that I have friends in jail right now because of protesting Palestine. And this year is unbelievable when I think about the different direct actions I've been a part of, when I think about the different movement work I've done, when I think about all the videos I posted online about what has been happening and why and how and trying to contextualize things. It makes me so angry, but it makes me also even more certain about why I'm living the life that I am, why I'm making art in the way that I am, why I'm organizing in the way that I am, and why I'm both simultaneously terrified of what the state is capable of, what liberalism is capable of, what black faces in high places are capable of, white faces in high places are capable of. All of these things just return me again and again to the fact that I'm not fucking voting. The fact that I don't think this system should exist. When people talk about Israel and apartheid and the fact that Israel is a settler colonial entity and it shouldn't exist and blah, 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 the most righteous of people, I look at the US in the same exact way. And I've wanted to make this video about anti-voting for a while to contextualize my position, because I do think it's really important to have an in-depth conversation around the different elements of our electoral cynicism. It's important to talk about the historical context of how especially Black bodies have been funneled into this logic of assimilation, of believing that voting is going to save us. Did you know that the Electoral College, the literal framework of how we vote in the US, was partially and majorly influenced by the slave trade? And Southern states wanted to use their slaves in order to gain more political power, despite not giving them any human rights. And this is why the Three-Fifths Compromise came about. History matters, that history is repeating itself, that we have to speak up when injustice is happening, and we have to not be afraid of fighting for ourselves, of not falling into the lesser evil argument, of being angry about things that people should be angry about. But I just want this video to help people that are deeply dissatisfied with the electoral process, that want other thoughts and perspective. I run a podcast called The Dugout, and we recently did a really great interview with a former Black Panther Party member, Jonina Abram-Irvin. And one of the things she talked about was the power and necessity and need to understand that fascism is on the rise and that we should be opposing fascism on a local level.
Now we're into the first, 25 years almost of the 21st century. So how to fight this rise of fascism? That's the way I see it. Many people think, well, Trump's just mouthing off and even if he gets elected, he's not going to do all this stuff. Well, I don't take that for granted. If people say they're going to do something, I think you need to pay attention to it. Okay. And like I said, I don't have all the answers. But one thing I do strongly believe in is that we must begin to build a movement fighting fascism. And I'm not saying it has to be all Black people. We have to unite with people of different races and nationalities. It has to be widespread, broad movement. But we have to begin to do that because fascism is on the rise in this country. And if we don't believe it, when we do finally believe it, it's going to be maybe too late.
So in the least, if you take anything from this video, it's pay attention to what is happening locally, find ways to pressure the politicians where you live locally, find ways to organize with people on large or small levels, cook for your neighbors, share resources with your friends, share clothes, make food, garden together, go out and share resources with people without housing, pass out Narcan, do things that in smaller, large ways can change the material conditions of the spaces that you live in or the people that you gather around. And in the least, that is what you can do. But the first thing I want to talk about is the Electoral College. The Electoral College, it's something that it was explained to me when I was 9, 10, 11, 12, but it was definitely one of those things when I was younger and it was explained to me and I was like, what? What is an electoral college? What do you mean we don't vote for our president? Let's just do a poll. Let's ask a question, right? I'm gonna ask you a question. How many countries in the world, other than the US, use the Electoral College? Can you guess? Oh, wait. Maybe you want to Google it. This is what we're going through right now. Like when people go into the ballot box or are going to the ballot box now, you're not even voting for the actual candidate. In 1787, the newly formed United States was grappling with how to balance power between states with the vastly different populations and economies. The Constitutional Convention took place amidst deep fears of instability fueled by Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was an armed uprising in western Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War soldier, sparked by economic hardship. After the American Revolution, many farmers were left in debt, facing high taxes, foreclosures, and imprisonment for unpaid loans. The rebellion's participants, many of whom were veterans, demanded debt relief and protested the government's failure to address their financial struggles. The rebellion reached a peak when Shay and his followers attempted to seize a federal arsenal. Though the uprising was eventually suppressed by state militia, it exposed significant flaws in the Articles of Confederation. The government was unable to provide military financial support to Massachusetts, highlighting its weaknesses under the Articles. The event became a pivotal moment that convinced many leaders, including George Washington and James Madison, the fledgling nation needed a stronger central government. Shays' Rebellion directly influenced the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. Shays' Rebellion exposed the fragility of the new republic and heightened the elite's fears of too much direct democracy. Too much direct democracy? Leaders feared that giving too much power to the masses could lead to chaotic governance and threats to property rights. At the heart of these debates was the question of how to elect a president. Northern and southern states were divided not only by geography, but by their reliance on slavery. Southern states with large populations of enslaved blacks had no rights or political power. This desire for power on the backs of black bodies led to the infamous 3/5 compromise, where enslaved blacks were counted as 3/5 of a person to increase the southern states' representation in Congress and the Electoral College. But what really drives me wild is it's the matter-of-factness of it. When I see people like Kamala Harris or Obama getting on the news and saying, if you don't vote, like it's whatever, F you, or you're giving up your power, don't be disenfranchised. I'm like, the literal foundation of how this country began was found on disenfranchisement. It was founded on genocide, on sexual assault, on human rights violations, on literal families being ripped apart, on breeding farms. And you're telling me that the convention that led to our electoral system as we know it was largely swayed by the economic demands of southern states to have their slaves give white people more political power. Do you like when we look at our world today and we look at the ways that Black communities, marginalized communities are extracted from for the electoral process in order to bolster up politicians, in order to fight for their votes, in order to move swing states, it's still an extraction of the political livelihoods of these communities to offer broken promises and then to give nothing back. And so the correlation to me is fucking maddening. History.com has an article called "Why Was the Electoral College Created?" At the time of the Philadelphia Convention, no other country in the world directly elected its chief executive, so delegates were wading into uncharted territory. Further complicating the task was deep-rooted distrust of executive power. After all, the fledgling nation had just fought its way out from under a tyrannical king and overarching colonial governors. They did not want another despot on their hands. One group of delegates felt strongly that Congress shouldn't have anything to do with picking the president. Too much opportunity for chummy corruption between the executive and legislative branches. Another camp was dead set against letting people elect the president by straight popular vote. First, they thought that 18th century voters lacked the resources to be fully informed about their candidates, especially in rural outposts. Second, they feared a headstrong Democratic mob steering the country astray. And third, a populist president appealing directly to the people command dangerous amounts of power. A populist president appealing to the people. Even though I don't fuck with the Electoral College, does that sound like anything familiar? Trump, it's Trump. And I'm going to get back into this article in a little bit, but to basically explain the Electoral College is each political party selects a number of electors who pledge to support their party's presidential and vice presidential candidate. And these electors are usually loyal party members, people that have worked in the party in some capacity. And on election day, when voters cast their ballots, when you vote for your presidential or vice presidential candidate, there's usually a name next to them. And there's not always a name. There can be like something else written there, but there's usually a name. And so when you're voting for your presidential or vice presidential candidate, what you're actually voting for is your party's electorate or elector. And the thing about the Electoral College that I thought was really interesting is that in 48 out of 50 states, including Washington, D.C., the winner of the popular vote in the states gets all of the state's electoral votes. This is known as the winner-takes-all system. So even if one candidate wins 51% of the vote, they end up getting 100% of the electors in that state. The exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, where there's a proportional system where electoral votes can be split between candidates. To become president, a candidate needs to win a majority of the 538 electoral votes, which is at least 270. If no one gets 270 votes, the election is decided by the House of Representatives, where each state delegate gets one vote. And what's interesting about this is that we do have numerous elections where you can look back at U.S. history and see that despite the popular vote, another candidate was actually able to win instead. Like when Al Gore ran against George W. Bush, I think I was like honestly like 8 or 9. But I remember that election and I remember everyone talking about it because Al Gore asked for recounts. But in a lot of people's historical perspective, he should have won. The confusion of the system, I mean, there's some central things here. There's the fear of direct democracy, and then there's also the fear that certain parts of the government will find or resort to corruption or populism in order to sway the masses. And there are so many things that I have to say about this, but one of the reasons that I'm an anarchist is that I actually don't fear direct democracy, or what was my co-host on the dugout saying, democratic confederalism? Democratic confederalism is a system that emphasizes grassroots democracy, local governments, and community-based decision-making. It challenges traditional state structures by promoting autonomy, environmental sustainability, gender equality, and cooperative economies. The system rejects nationalism and instead advocates for democratic self-rule at a local level where communities make decisions through councils and assemblies. And when I read the background of the Electoral College, but it's just so interesting that so much of it is based on a fear that people don't know how to govern themselves, that people can't be trusted. You need a politician, you need someone who's higher up, who's economically driven or politically driven. When I think like a lot of that is just power imbalance. In 1787, roughly 40% of living in southern states were enslaved Black people who couldn't vote. James Madison from Virginia, where enslaved blacks accounted for 60% of the population, knew that either a direct presidential election or one with electors divided up according to free white residents only wouldn't fly in the South. Madison goes on to say the right of suffrage was much more diffusive i.e. extensive in the northern than the southern states, said Madison, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes. The result was the controversial three-fifths compromise, in which 3/5 of enslaved black populations could be counted towards allocating representatives and electors and calculating federal taxes. The compromise ensured that southern states would ratify the Constitution and give Virginia home to more than 200,000 slaves, a quarter of the total electoral votes required to win the president. And there's another piece that I found online called The Electoral College and the Framers' Distrust of Democracy. In The Basics of American Politics, the author writes, the Electoral College was created by the authors of the Constitution as another way of filtering what they feared might be the passions and prejudices of the mass of voters. In another textbook, The Politics of American Government, the authors write, the framers believed that the general electorate could not make an informed, dispassionate, rational judgment. In The American Democracy, the author writes, the delegates believed that ordinary citizens, most of whom could neither read or write, were too poorly informed to choose wisely. More important, the framers feared that popular election could enable a tyrant to capture the presidency by appealing to people's fears and prejudices. The author of Approaching Democracy claimed the framers wanted to insulate the office from what they considered the popular passions and transitory fancies of the electorate. The author of Inside the System writes, despite many differences of opinion among the delegates about the executive, there was a slow drift towards 2 points of agreement. The people should not elect the president because that would be too much democracy. When I read this, this is what I literally mean. When people come into my comments or go online and they're like, you need to vote for the lesser evil, like, vote, like, we don't even have a fucking democracy. Our electoral college is literally underpinned by the structural belief that regular people don't know how to vote or govern for themselves. And this is what I mean when people are so against like socialism or communism or anarchism or non-hierarchical systems of governance or alternatives. We live in a political system that disenfranchises us from deeply engaging regardless. People are barely paid enough. They work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. The mainstream media is propagandizing to us. And then election season rolls around and you see ad after ad after ad after ad on your TV. This candidate loves illegal immigrants. This person doesn't care about guns. We are propagandized to by capitalism. And somehow that is a justifiable enough electoral process and way of politicizing people. But giving people a living wage, giving people healthcare, giving people the space and the room and the time to engage in their communities because their government and the state actually offers them the things that they need, that isn't considered humane or necessary or viable or even just a better process. Like I think about the fact that most people barely have time to engage or think about the world politically. And then to live in a government that from the beginning has never fucking trusted you to actually know what your community or your community or the people around you might want. And it's this layer of distrust that is built into the system that also makes me distrust the system as it stands. Like, I don't understand how we're being asked to vote for a lesser evil when the system doesn't even fucking trust us and thinks we're fucking dumb. Populism can be a legitimate danger and is a legitimate danger, especially when yielded by fascistic or tyrannical candidates. But it's our job as individuals and collectives to oppose populism, especially like fascistic or tyrannical populism. And so to jump over that and then to say like, no, actually, it should just be a bunch of white men and the white men who own slaves should have more power. This paper goes on to say, some presidency textbooks also explain the adoption of the Electoral College by the fear of democracy. In The American Presidency, the author writes, the delegates virtually ignored Wilson's proposal for popular election. In principle, the idea was too democratic for their tastes. They thought of democracy mainly as mob rule. And when I hear this, and this is why the Shays Rebellion element is so important. This is why like thinking of Nat Turner's rebellion is important. Like, I even think about 2020, the reason that people got so fucking scared. The reason that politicians got so fucking scared is that so much of this is literally about the distrust of regular people being able to decide, analyze, look at what is happening around them, and to make a decision politically. And I do think there is nuance, but I don't think the solution is not trusting people. I think the solution is creating a political system and social life where people can engage and be a part of the political system and have the time and the room and the space and the critical thinking through public institutions to do that. Not propaganda, not lobbying, not the fucking system we have. I mean, how many fucking billions of dollars is Israel given to our fucking electoral season? And it goes on to say, of course, the framers were distrustful of democracy, and that distrust is reflected in the structure of the Constitution. The separation of powers was designed to assure that power could not be concentrated in one branch. The checks and balances built into the Constitution were designed to slow down policy, making so that a sudden impulse on the part of the people could not easily be enacted to the detriment of the minority. The different and overlapping tenure of office in the three branches make it impossible to change the whole government's elected representatives in one cycle. And what's interesting in this is, like, if you look at Project 2025, this is literally what Project 2025 is trying to upend. It's important to look at the specifics. It's okay to be cynical of the way that the Electoral College was formed and to understand that a lot of it was underpinned by racism and white supremacy. And it's also important to understand that checks and balances should exist on a governance level. And it's also important to understand that the checks and balances that are in place barely fucking work. Roe v. Wade was overturned. Cop cities are being built all around the country. Books are being banned all around the country. Project 2025 is presenting, unitary executive decision making or whatever. All of this is sinister, but it's enfolded within a logic that says that the U.S. as a governmental system, how do we hold our government accountable for engaging in imperialistic, anti-Black, or colonial violence? Like, why can't we have checks and balances that are interested in checking and balancing those things? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, to me, to see checks and balances, I'm like, what about the checks and balances for the enslaved Blacks? And then this was one of my favorite analogies in this whole piece. George Mason on July 17th also argued against popular election of the executive. In his oft quoted analogy, George Mason says, he conceived that it would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for the chief magistrate of the people as it would to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. At first glance, it seems that Mason is taking an anti-democratic stand, perhaps for the reasons that Pinkley has articulated. But note the nature of the analogy. A blind man is not a good judge of colors, not because he is incapable of solid reasoning. He is not a good judge of colors because he cannot perceive the appropriate information. This reasoning became evident in Mason's next sentence. The extent of the country renders it impossible that the people can have the requisite capacity to judge of the respective pretensions of the candidates. What is so interesting about this is that I think the fears of mob rule, of direct democracy, also the fears of southern states using enslaved Blacks to bolster their political power and their decision-making in terms of who the president is, mimics the same anti-voting and disenfranchisement kind of policies that we see now. I mean, if our government can structure itself on a foundational level to ensure that a direct democracy isn't possible, and it can also compromise to the point where it considers a Black person 3/5 of a human being in order to help southern white states gain more political power or find the compromise of what the economic power translates to in terms of political power. What does it mean that we have a political system today that relies on voter suppression, that relies on disinformation, that we have a 2024 election where Black counties, places where Black people, marginalized people tend to live, are already being targeted by voter suppression policies where they want to hand count the votes? History repeats itself, or it refracts. And I think both the 3/5 compromise and current voter suppression policies, legislation, laws work to maintain power imbalances that disenfranchise Black and marginalized communities. And the fact that our founding documents were based in this logic and that we still live in a system today where these logics are possible just shows that these structural inequalities haven't disappeared, and we still need to have a structural confrontation with what voting means at all. Like, It disappoints me so much that this is the system that we've been handed and that we've been engaging with. Like it to me, it literally doesn't make any sense. And then we're guilted into voting, and it's like, this doesn't make any sense. If we fear direct democracy so much that we're willing to take the system as it is right now, it's almost like saying that the imperialistic and colonial and genocidal violence that has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen is not as horrible as a future where we craft our political lives for ourselves, both individually and collectively. And that assumption, that assertion, that idea is so unimaginative to me. It's so based in a colonial logic. And it's exactly why we are where we are. And it's maddening to me that we've accepted a reality where our political disenfranchisement is just baked into the system as we know it.
You work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
How has historical restrictions on Black political power, from the Three-Fifths Compromise to Jim Crow laws, shaped modern tactics of voting suppression? How did the Three-Fifths Compromise use Black bodies to empower slaveholders without granting Black people political voice? And how does this logic continue in today's political systems? In what ways does participation in the U.S. electoral system reinforce a global imperial structure? And how does this affect the right for Black liberation, both domestic and abroad? And I have so many answers to this question, but it comes down to me for this major question about complicity and empire. And complicity, even on the most simplest terms, and complicity can be seen as like assimilation or agreement or participation, but when we're participating in voting, are we actually empowering ourselves? And are there different ways of engaging politically, even in terms of voting structures, that empower us even more? And for Black people, I look at how the U.S. stands and I see in every era of our enslavement, disenfranchisement, subjugation, we have fought for our liberation while also fighting for political, legal, civil legibility. Liberation and civil legibility are very different things. While Black Americans have fought hard to secure voting rights, from the civil rights movement, where there were the Montgomery bus boycotts, which helped bolster MLK and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to the Birmingham Children's Crusade, to the Voting Rights Act, to so many nonviolent direct actions where Black bodies were put on the line, to the voting suppression of today. The idea that voting alone will lead to Black autonomy is simply a myth. It's a myth that has been sold to us, and I think contextualizing that myth matters. And the myth is rooted in a system designed to suppress Black voices. Yes, you could have Kamala Harris or President Obama or Michelle Obama get to high places of power. Yes, they can be the face of imperialism, but how much did that Black representation actually translate to mass improvement of Black life, of an increase in Black autonomy, of Black people being able to free themselves from a system that has subjugated them for hundreds of years? And if Black people in high places can't help us get closer to this, what is the point of our participation at all? And today, I believe the struggle should be from pushing people to vote, viewing that as political representation or power or autonomy, and towards building out mass movements that can oppose imperialism, building out these democratic confederalist structures where we can vote locally, determine what institutions are in our communities, determine how we deal with horizontal violence, determine how we share resources and deal with conflict. If we can govern ourselves, maybe there's a way. Maybe there is a way. Right? Martin Luther King's 1957 Give Us the Ballot speech was delivered at a pivotal point in the civil rights movement. At the time, despite the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, Black Americans in the South still face systemic disenfranchisement and violence, whether it be Jim Crow segregation, whether it be extrajudicial violence, whether it be the KKK and lynchings. Delivered at the prayer pilgrimage for freedom in Washington, D.C., King's speech called for federal intervention to protect voting rights. And I recently did an episode of The Dugout where we played a bit of this speech, and I want to play a little bit again in this video to contextualize some of the different thoughts around Black voting and autonomy through time. And if there's any deeper context beyond this that folks want to provide or leave in the comments, feel free to share. But I wanted to play a little bit of this speech to give people some context.
Request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy. And we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine.
Honestly, every time I listen to this, I get kind of emotional, and it always surprises me. But I think I'm getting emotional now because I mentioned this in the episode that we recorded recently. It makes me emotional that MLK is envisioning a future that hasn't existed yet. And even if I, as someone in modernity or contemporary times, can be like, I don't know about nonviolence or whatever. And even MLK, like there's certain strategies and tactics that he deployed and thought that I don't fully agree with. But what makes me emotional is his ability to articulate a reality that hasn't existed yet for Black people in the US. And to have the courage to envision that, to have the language, the power, the specificity, the love, the desire, it's moving. And I find it beautiful because without this, where would we be now? Where would we be now? And there are a few other things that I detect in that. Two, what he's talking about is the process of achieving Black autonomy through the process of voting and self-determination. Self-determination is a huge element of what MLK is pushing for. And even more than this, it's almost like a rebuttal to the reasonings behind the Electoral College. He literally says like the white masses or the white mob that like are slaveholders or racist or whatever. And it's interesting because you can see as a Black disenfranchised person, what Martin Luther King fears is the white majority rule, is the political incentives, the economic incentives, and the genocidal incentives of white supremacy. And what he is pushing for is for Black people to have political representation so they can determine what judges, what politicians, what political entities operate in their cities and communities. And to instead be Black citizens, Black people living on this land, forced to work, to pay taxes, to do all of these things while having no political power whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense. But what's sinister about the Electoral College and the way that it's set up and what MLK is fighting against is that whiteness will trust itself to make any political decision and say that that is a sign of civility, of civilization, of a just society, while Black people who are subjugated to white supremacists and tyrannical violence who are advocating for themselves are considered unpatriotic, are considered inhumane, are considered less than. And for MLK to argue this, I think is so beautiful and seemingly radical for his time period. I mean, there were all sorts of other people that were advocating for voting rights. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, so many other people. But I wanted to bring us to MLK because he's one of the most, I guess, revered figures. And Give Us the Ballot is essentially a call for voting rights in order for Black people to determine for themselves what kind of lives they want to live. And that to me is beautiful. It's beautiful. But white supremacy reforms itself. White supremacy reforms itself. After this 1957 speech, obviously MLK's star rose. He participated in countless campaigns, movement demonstrations to oppose segregation, to oppose voter disenfranchisement, to demand equal rights and the end of segregation. And eventually all of this would lead to the Montgomery bus boycotts, the freedom rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, organizations like SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, countless organizations fighting for Black political autonomy through violent and nonviolent means. And then around 1964, 1965, the Birmingham Children's Crusade happens, which was a march in Birmingham, Alabama, where literal Black school children were marching to push for an end to segregation, and they were attacked with water hoses, with dogs. Some spent days, weeks in jail. And these were children. And these images shocked the nation, shocked our government, shocked our country. And eventually in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which sought to remove barriers like literacy tests and poll taxes that would disenfranchise and lead to systemic disenfranchisement of Black voters. But despite these victories, there was still the question of, what is Black liberation? Why is there still anti-Black and socio-political violence happening against Black people? Why is police brutality still so commonplace? Why are we participating in the war in Vietnam? Why are Blacks being drafted to go and fight Vietnamese people in other parts of the world when they don't even have political say and autonomy in the places that they live? The 60s as a flashpoint is so interesting. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have the founding of the Black Panther Party in 1966. Or we have Malcolm X giving the famous ballot or the bullet speech in 1964. But I think the mid-60s is the beginning of this deeper confrontation with the fact that, yes, Black people have fought for self-determination through the process of voting. But even with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we can still see afterwards what would happen. The Black Panther Party would push for survival programs for community self-defense. They would be opposed on almost every level. The government of California would literally try to pass gun laws that were particularly targeted at the Black Panther Party to stop them from open carrying. The counterintelligence program would be started by the FBI to destabilize the civil rights movement, to destabilize the Black Power movement, to destabilize the anti-war movement. And so even as Black people are fighting for political autonomy and self-determination and voting rights, you can still see the government in the background in white supremacy reforming itself to further disenfranchise Black people outside of the electoral system. And this is why the mid-1960s and Malcolm X's perspective and the Black Power perspective is so important, because so much of the shift in the 60s is away from this logic that says the government will come around, they will help us. And it moves more towards, how do we get our own and protect it, because they will inevitably fuck us up and try to destroy what we have.
We had strategies to help protect us. You know, we know how these people come.
We realized that this was not what we anticipated.
They didn't blow 3-inch holes in the party walls. They blew off the whole front of our house.
And then we took a position in the front bedroom of 6223. Move would be to our left as we were looking on the Osage.
The tear gas started coming in. We got the blankets and they was wet, and we had them in the bucket and they was wet until we put them over our heads and started laying down.
There was a short lull, very short lull, and then that's when the shooting started.
Did you have any information or belief that there was any gasoline stored on the roof of 6221 Osage Avenue?
I don't recall. I've heard that several times since. I don't recall having been told prior to that there was gasoline stored on the roof.
All the men was upstairs.
All the men were upstairs. And then what happened?
Huh? They were still up there, and then they came down. Everybody came down.
All the men came down?
That's when the big bomb went off.
Did you hear the big bomb?
It shook the whole house up.
The house shake. We knew something had happened. It never, ever occurred to me that they had dropped a bomb on us.
So let's play a little bit of the ballot or the bullet.
Our people should never let themselves be trapped intellectually into thinking that whenever they do something to defend themselves against the violence of the white man, that they're being violent. But you're advocating violence. No, we're advocating the necessity of black people defending themselves against the violence of the white man, because the American government has already proven itself either unable or unwilling to defend us as it should do.
Well, the white man hasn't gone out to create any marches, nor has he gone out to do anything that would make the people in the communities feel that he was opposed by law to their thinking.
No, all he has done is fix his police dogs on innocent black women and babies. All he has done is put his fire hoses on innocent women and children, black women and children. Right. Or all he has done is shoot Medgar Evers in the back. Right. Or he has bombed the church in Birmingham, Alabama, and murdered 4 innocent little girls. Right. Or he has shot down young boys from their bicycle as they were riding innocently through the street. Right. That's all he has done.
Right. Well, you feel that this is a cause for the Negro to take on the violent act?
It's not a case of the Negro taking on a violent act, but it's a case of the Negro doing what is necessary to defend himself against the violent acts of the whites. Right. Since the government has refused to defend the Negro. Right. The church was bombed and the government has done nothing about it. Right. Medgar Evers was murdered and the government has done nothing about it. To really get some meaningful results, it has to be taken out of Uncle Sam's hands and taken into a world court. And the world court that has been set up to listen to the complaints of human rights violations is in the United Nations. Human rights are international, and civil rights come within the jurisdiction of the country where these rights are violated.
Did you hear that? Human rights are international, and civil rights come from the jurisdiction of the country that you come from. This is why I fucking love Malcolm X. One, he's so incisive. He's situating black self-defense and political resistance as justifiable against this white person who's trying to go against him. And then 2, in his assertion of civil rights versus human rights. I think I was literally just talking about it earlier in this video, like the fact that we are demanding civil rights from a government that was structurally built its system of electoralism to disenfranchise us, it doesn't make any sense. And oh my gosh, this is why I love listening to Malcolm X speeches, because my mind just goes... The distinction of saying that we need to defend our human rights, theoretically, and not our civil rights, that contextualizes perfectly the title of the speech. Give us the ballot, which is him pulling from MLK, or give us the means to defend ourselves. If you won't give us political autonomy and representation and the ability to determine what can happen in our communities for ourselves, give us the right to defend ourselves in the least. Give us the right to defend ourselves. After we vote, what is our process of defending ourselves? What is our process of opposing the genocidal violence and imperialistic violence that we're exporting in other places in the world? What does that process even look like? This speech is so good. This speech is so good. I have to play some more.
But the black people in this country, all of our human characteristics were destroyed by slavery. Our language was destroyed. Our history was destroyed. Our culture was destroyed. And then the white man taught us that we were savages in the jungle and living at a subhuman level. And for this reason, when they put the Constitution together, they classified our people as 3/5 of a man, which meant subhuman, not a complete human being. And once our human characteristics were completely destroyed, this gave them justification for treating us like we were animals. And it also justified their selling us from plantation to plantation like you sell a horse and a cow and a bag of wheat. White George Washington himself historically is on record as having sold or having traded a black man for a keg of molasses, which shows you he didn't regard that black man as a human being. Well, if the black man's human rights had been respected, he never could have been a slave here in America. And if his human rights had been restored by the Emancipation Proclamation, automatically we would have been citizens right after the Civil War. So we must be regarded as human. Our human rights must be respected before we can ever be regarded as citizens and our civil rights be respected.
The way that he articulates the sheer structural inhumanity and how that structural inhumanity should lead us to be cynical, if not antagonistic towards the system as it stands. And the fact that he returns to the phrase human rights, human rights, human rights. And this is what I think is interesting about the political dichotomy that arose. Through what framework do we begin to have the logic to defend ourselves? And give us the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet? There's so many different ways that you could read that. You could read that as give us the ballot or give us some bullets, or we will find bullets. Or it could be read as give us the ballot, or if you're not going to give us the ballot, you're going to give us the bullet. Like you're going to give us like the ability to politically represent ourselves, or you're going to just continue to kill us. And it's just so phenomenal in the shift towards Black power and Malcolm X's iteration of self-determination for Black communities and him pushing towards this internationalism or Pan-Africanism. It shifts away from the civil rights era of demanding that we have political autonomy and legibility and self-determination through integration and assimilation into a government, a country, and a system that has locked us out. And it shifts from that towards having a much more clear, antagonistic, and vitriolic critique of U.S. imperialism and colonization. And this critique also necessitates the question of, do we want to be politically represented in this? If so, how, and what is the realistic process of engaging in that? Rather than relying solely on voting, Malcolm X and the Black Power movement emphasized the need for Black people to take control over their communities, build independent political powers, and to be willing to resist by any means necessary.
You ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment, we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through, what Black people have experienced in this country since the time the first Black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
I broke my tape measure earlier. I'm trying to fix it. Maybe if I put it in the other way. Okay, that way won't work. Maybe we can just neatly... And then... That didn't work. His point about us living through the American nightmare is so succinct and so needed. And it kind of relates to the thing that I've always said, America is something to survive. And so from this standpoint, why are we voting and participating in a system that will only continue to ensure our subjugation and the subjugation of other people? And what does it mean to build and have our own in order to actually have true and meaningful self-determination? And when I look at the political landscape as it stands, I don't see anything in the mainstream that speaks to this ongoing socio-political violence, whether it be against Black communities, poor whites, trans people, immigrants, undocumented people, people that come here and are migrants or refugees and experience xenophobia and experience political violence. Children experience political violence in this country. And it really bothers me how voting is purported as this moral act of political participation, when underpinning all of that are the countless and extensive forms of violence that the U.S. deploys and resorts to in order to dissuade dissent, in order to politically intervene in other countries, in order to accept money from war profiting machines, or to give money to war profiting companies to stand by as other nations commit war crimes and human rights violations. And all of those things make sense because the US and how it was founded is underpinned by these same logics. So why would we upend them to give the disenfranchised people that fueled our political economy from its beginning to now have political power? It doesn't make sense. And this is what Malcolm X is talking about. He's like, give us the ballot or give us a fucking gun. What does voting even mean today? Is voting participating in a system in good faith that funds genocide by the billions? Is voting our way to change our local environments and to pass legislation that will ensure that us and other people have human rights, civil rights? Is voting yet another economic system propped up by the elite and billionaires' dollars? I mean, the DNC literally has booths where people can pay to go to the DNC, and it costs $500,000. Why is anything tied to our political system and witnessing it, bearing witness to it, cost $500,000? And this is what angers me when people are like, your ancestors fought for your right to vote. My ancestors fought for me to have political self-determination. And yes, they maybe fought for political representation, but not all of them fought for like a flat political representation that just means that we become imperialists and colonizers and the new face to genocide and imperialism. Or when people say, you can have a Black woman as president, you're sexist. I'm like, so a Black woman is allowed to be the face of imperialism and genocide? A Black woman is our scapegoat for what we believe imperialistic liberation is? Like a Black woman's identity can be weaponized for the sake of continuing the US's goal of world domination and genocide. Oh, a Black woman is the answer. A Black face is what America really needs in the next phase. Maybe instead of there being white supremacy, there's just going to be Black imperialism and supremacy. The lesser evil of today is more evil than the lesser evil of yesterday. It's important to contextualize what voting has meant in the past, how voting and the struggle for civil rights, which i.e. is actually just our human rights, has funneled us into a process of assimilation, and how now our responsibility is to build mass movements and political structures and ways of living and existing that allow us to fight our way out of this integration, this assimilation, and this participation in the empire. I want to bring in a podcast that I just listened to from the Ezra Klein Show, and it's called What's Wrong with Donald Trump? And this is a 44-minute podcast episode where they break down how Trump goes off the rails during his rallies, how there have been numerous books and texts written about the fact that he is an unfit ruler, he doesn't follow the rules, he can't take no for an answer, he's nonsensical, about all of the disinformation and lies that he's shared, about the fact that he is an outlier candidate who doesn't represent a lot of the ethos of what we usually say democracy is. And this whole 44-minute episode, they didn't say the word fascism once, as far as I heard. They didn't say it once. When we are offered the illusion of choice and then enter a political system, a media system, a reality that engages in the illusion of choice, that treats the illusion of choice as factual, as real, as legitimate, we are buying into an illusory democracy that can't even name the violence as it is. And this was even a line that was in the Ezra Klein episode. It says, in order to identify something, you have to be able to name it. And it was interesting to me because I was like, through this whole episode, like, he's literally describing like disinformation and all these tendencies of fascistic leaders and how Prior to 2025 is an extension of this, but Ezra Klein doesn't really ever name it as fascistic, doesn't really name it as white supremacist, doesn't really ever name it as whatever it is. And this neutrality, this neutral approach, this objective approach that isn't that is unable to name the violence, I think is one of the many reasons that we're in the situation that we're in. And this begs the question, why continue to vote for or under a system that doesn't actually work for us, that doesn't actually work for the large majority of people, that still wants to give money to the elite, that wants to align with what lobbying companies and corporations and those who are funding these political campaigns want? Don't vote for this person because they represent what the US doesn't want to be, and vote for this person because they represent what the US does want to be. And in this is this kind of fallacy that ignores the fact that all of the progressive ideals or all of the claims for democracy or being a melting pot or whatever that the most progressive area of the American public can even claim has been bought for by the blood and torture and suffering and the struggles of Black, brown, and indigenous movements. Historically, the side of the aisle, the Democratic side of the aisle, the progressive side of the aisle that is claiming these victories, that is claiming these histories, actually historically has worked to fight against them, to be complicit or procrastinate the legislation that would actually need to happen to give people their human rights. And so we once again are engaging in this equation where we haven't actually figured out how to oppose or fight the structural wrong that is against us, which is imperialism, which is anti-Blackness, which is bigotry, which is xenophobia. If our government reliably resorts to these things, what is our responsibility to actually oppose them as citizens of this? And should we be participating in this system? We can go even further to once again think about all of the money in politics and electoralism. In the 2020 presidential election alone, in the least, $14.4 billion was spent to get those candidates running, to get them through their campaigns. And I ask, what could $14 billion be spent on instead? Could it be spent on securing reproductive rights and health for people all throughout the nation? Could it be spent on a more humane process of immigration? Could it be spent on, I don't know, revolutionizing our school system? Could it be spent on providing alternatives to policing as we know it? Could it be spent on the homelessness crisis? Could it be spent on recovering the climate and investing in a more green economy? If all of this money can be allocated towards our electoral system, what does it say that that same amount of money can't be allocated towards giving American citizens and people a more justifiable way of life, of giving us more humane institutions and systems? And so even from that standpoint, we can see that electoralism as it stands isn't really as effective in creating a direct democracy or democracy that is like really in line with what America claims to be claims to be all the time. And our institutions also fail in the same way that our electoral system fails as well. Our schools operate as a school to prison pipeline. Our hospitals operate to reinforce certain racial biases. Prisons and police and jails operate to denigrate and punish the poor and criminalize certain bodies. And the most ideal forms of these institutions are life-giving, are reparative, are rehabilitative. That can't be possible unless we actually demand for and fight for a political system that sees those things as justifiable and real and righteous investments, as opposed to political intervention in other places abroad, as opposed to propaganda, which leads to xenophobia, as opposed to more money being flooded into a political system that claims to be for us and not for the elite. The way identity is weaponized in the current political process and electoral season. I mean, recently I was listening to a podcast called Vibe Check, and it's three queer Black men who were journalists or have worked in the media in various capacities. And it was a really interesting conversation because it was a conversation about how, in the news cycle as of recent, it's been a huge topic of conversation as to why more Black men don't support Kamala Harris. Different news organizations and media entities have gone to Black communities, have interviewed people, and they've seen that older Black folks tend to really be registered to vote. They tend to vote very Democrat. These are people that are the survivors of the civil rights movement. And then there are younger Black folks that have been reported in the media to be wary of Kamala's record, as being wary of having a woman leadership or whether or not a Black woman can lead us. And this has even led to controversy, which has been written about, where former President Barack Obama has admonished Black voters and Black folks, for especially Black men, for not being in more support of Kamala Harris. And this is a recent piece from NPR titled "Obama in Blunt Terms Tells Black Men to Get Over Their Reluctance to Support Harris." My understanding, based on reports I'm getting from campaigns and communities, is that we have not yet seen the same kinds of energy and turnout in all quarters of our neighborhoods and communities as we saw when I was running. The lack of enthusiasm for Harris, Obama said, seems to be pronounced with the brothers. He chided voters who were voting for Trump or not casting a vote at all. "And you're thinking about sitting out," Obama said. "Part of it makes me think, and I'm speaking to men directly, part of it makes me think, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president, and you're coming up with alternatives and other reasons for that." And Obama has been criticized for this because in the past, Obama has resorted to shame and guilt in order to intervene in certain political moments that he deems as something that he can speak to. And the podcast I listened to was very interesting because it broke down the fact that older Black men tend to support Kamala Harris. And these hosts of the Vibe Check expertly mentioned that Black men are disproportionately targeted by the police and prison system. Kamala Harris is a Black person who is a prosecutor, who is a district attorney, and who is attorney general, and has spoken to the fact that she has both done progressive reforms that are more aligned with communities that want to abolish or reform the prison system, and has also had reforms and policies that have been heavily criticized for how they reinforce the violence of the carceral system, whether it be her anti-truancy policies that were passed to criminalize parents if their kids did not go to school. And so when Obama flattens this conversation around what Black men think or feel or what their opinions of Harris are, it also feeds into this narrative that Black men are just inherently misogynistic, and some of the critiques that they have of Harris aren't useful or justifiable or even necessary to listen to because we have this greater evil against us. But I ask the question, why do we not assume that Black people, when they enter the political establishment, can also be a part of the problem as well? And this is where the reductionism of identity politics can be so sinister and just kind of, to me, scary, because it essentially is Black people shouting down other Black people and telling them, if you don't vote for Kamala, you don't really want a future where you have a right to vote or a right to exist. When in actuality, there are things that Kamala Harris supports and pushes forward and is complicit on that represent actual structural dangers to Black communities, to poor communities, to brown communities. What does a meaningful politicized life look like? I'm going to put this clip at the beginning, but could you say your name and describe the kind of work that you do?
I'm Jordan Mays. I use they, them pronouns. Really, it's dealer's choice. I am an abolitionist. I work and find and use my political expressions in lockstep and in solidarity with folks that are facing incarceration or the threat of incarceration and are facing different sorts of political, social repression. And to me, it's really important, especially around like a conversation of not voting. Like, these are folks who can't vote. And even if they could, probably wouldn't every time. Like, it's people where I can have this real conversation of being like, okay, we have this system above us. How do we actually change it? And we're not getting caught up on voting and not voting, because we know we can have this whole political rich world that'll exist with or without what the state's gonna do. And we need to know how to react more than we think our vote will plan or help us plan a certain way to react.
What is your perspective on voting as it's presented to us?
Voting and be able to use it as a political and material thing to meet people where they're at. There's so many misconceptions, and even bringing up the conversation brings up a lot of emotions in folks that immediately we put our walls up, and it's hard to really get that vulnerable and open conversation with other folks and really think about like long-term strategy when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm always debating like, oh, anarchists always come too late to the electoral popular front, but maybe we should be like opening up that conversation on what it means to organize non-voters so that the electoral popular front really is like crazy. It's like, oh, what if, like, because it would be interesting if like, oh, a third of America randomly votes one time.
Yeah.
That like the third that never vote. So much energy. Physically disgusts me to see a campaign, a local campaign, get like $1 million overnight when like unhoused baddies, trans baddies still out here with no money on the GoFundMe. So it's interesting.
What do you say to people that say if you don't vote, then you're giving your vote to Trump, or it's important to take a stand against Trump and we need to have a sort of better opponent in office? What do you say to folks that think that, feel that, reinforce that?
You tell me I'm throwing away my vote by not voting. I am throwing it away. And I'm throwing it off the side of a cliff. I'm abstaining. And
why,
that's a political action.
Why is throwing the vote away, like, why does that have value to you?
Because I've voted against Trump before when I felt so powerless that voting felt like the only political action I could take that really matters. And especially even just over the past 4 years, I've been able to build a material and political community and be a part of that to the point where I feel like I can say like, oh yeah, I do everything but voting. And then there's like very sensitive information things that keep me away from voting, or used to, with different like lines of anti-fascist work. But I think, oh, what was the question?
What do you say to people that say you're throwing your vote away, and what is the value of throwing your vote away?
I think it was Kwame Ture that said voting every 4 years and thinking that's your political thing is peak bourgeois propaganda. And I can't help but agree, because that's what a lot of people just do. And even America is begging for voters in and of itself. I am a part of, like, I'm not the only non-voter in the world. And I do think that there's a worthwhileness to be able to recognize why folks are not engaging with the state at this level, at this like so basic level. I do think that it's important to vote in down ballot stuff.
And what does that mean for people that don't know?
Policy positions. Being able to use voting as a way to reach people and organize your people is something that SNCC talks a lot about, especially because the condition would be different if like I didn't have the ability to vote at all. That would be like, we're in the streets, we're talking about it. Like, we're really organizing around being able to be recognized as a political and human entity. And I think it's not because being able to vote will give us our human rights, but it's like a basic inequity that the state has and is maintaining and has maintained, kind of like borders now. It's like, do I want a safer border or do I want no border? And how much of that looks the same?
Yeah. Do I want a safer imperialism or the illusion of choosing a more dangerous imperialism? Is one of the reasons I feel like it's important for me, at least, to articulate these ideas online, is that when I think people don't even begin to have the conversation, to your point about why people don't vote, why people are uncommitted, what the political kind of opportunity in that space is, whether or not it's being antagonistic towards the state or state structures, or it's like finding alternatives, kind of like what you're saying.
In these community organizations, spaces where you get together and do some direct action, direct aid, some mutual aid. I actually love voting. I vote once a week, monthly, all the time, in community organizations where I know my vote really matters, but it's also more about my political expression and autonomy is respected, and the democratic systems that we've made are way more democratic than the American Republic that I live under. And I think that sort of prefigurative action gives me the political expression I need to safely say, oh, I do everything but voting. That being said, I think it's a very personal thing. That sort of opening up that level of community and being able to have any sort of political expression and practice of that outside of the state, I think is extremely, extremely, extremely important, especially for anti-authoritarian, and especially important for folks who are like thinking and knowing and waking up and being like, this model does not work. Like, our type of governance does not allow me to have real conversations with people I even disagree with. It's too polarized.
The state does have a logic and they work off of a set of parameters, but sometimes I feel like when people say like, oh, vote, we have the weaker adversary, it's almost like the assumption that we can set up some of the conditions that the state will have for us in the near or far future. And granted, I do think certain candidates, certain positions, certain parties being in office are better in terms of certain social conditions, but I feel like
worse for others. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Talk about repression. 2025, Project 2025 and Trump is terrifying, but so is Kamala Harris, because I'm a radical. I'm an anti-statist. I hate the settler colony. Do I want a president that has a stronger connection to the intelligence community? At least Republicans hate them.
No.
But a Democrat will be lockstep with the intelligence community. So that really, and I'm talking about like state intelligence, military intelligence, and the stuff that historically fucks over activists and revolutionaries like me. So that, to me, like, both are existential threats.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they talk and the way that they move are existential, are threats in a way that looking at both of them is enough to be like, we have to move. We have to start organizing. Like, this is counterinsurgency 202 at this point. Like,
black faces in high places can't save us. And I think, what you just said is
but they
great.
can enslave us.
Yeah.
I thought, how could they do that? How could they not talk to me? And then they said they're going to put this pipeline. They're going to put it to a burial ground right there. What happens when that breaks? What happens to this? What happens to our water? It's like the same old story with the government and the agencies and big oil. We don't matter. So we have to fight to live.
In 2016, I was living in Seattle and Bernie Sanders was running as a progressive candidate. And I remember arguing with a lot of white people about the time about why I didn't like the idea of Bernie, why I thought it was weird that people were making all these cute memes about him online, and how the racial reckoning that I'd witnessed over the last year, especially via the Black Lives Matter movement, made me extremely cynical of any notion of electoral progress. I mean, Obama had been president, body cameras had been instituted in many different police departments, and Black people were still being shot and killed and villainized after their murder. And this made enthusiasm around the 2016 election or even a progressive candidate difficult for me. I lived in Seattle. I decided to travel out of the country for the first time. I went to France. I went to my first riot during the Nuit Debout protests. I got to see more examples of militant social change, of people, thousands of people in the streets marching, property damage, in the name of labor rights, of defending justifiable working conditions. When I came back to the US, I ended up getting a job working for a super PAC during the 2016 election. And I was going out and canvassing and talking to people on university campuses and educating people on the environment, educating people about why at the time Hillary Clinton was a better candidate for people to vote for. I mean, this was a job. I ended up hating this job, quitting it, and I learned of a movement that was happening at the time, the Standing Rock movement. For those that don't know, the Standing Rock movement was an indigenous-led movement to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline, and I ended up going to Standing Rock 3 different times. I got to witness thousands of people gathered with tents and supplies, offering childcare, training people on direct action, training people on media preparedness, building out these structures that could make this movement continue and continue. And by that point, I think the movement, when I first went, it had been happening for a good 2 months. And I was amazed because I'd never been in an autonomous space where money wasn't needed, where the rules of the US didn't matter, and people were operating, as Martin Sostre would kind of say, through a prefigurative politic. And it was really inspiring. It was really moving. I went there once and then I went back again. And the second time I went, the campaigns got more intense. You could see that Dapple and the security company that they hired, Tiger Swan, where they were flying drones over the camps more. You kind of heard whispers of the fact that there were infiltrators in the movement, and the government, Obama, politicians were paying lip service to the movement. They weren't actually trying to really stop this pipeline. News hit after news hit after news hit had already come out showing how not only was the election happening, Trump was kind of in the national zeitgeist. Despite all this debate on the mainstream, here I was in this space trying to be in solidarity with the movement that was trying to fight this foundational evil, colonization. There was this one camp that was constructed in the path of part of the pipeline. I knew someone that ended up staying there, and they ended up getting brutally arrested. They ended up being put to a ditch with indigenous people and being made to watch as the Dakota Access Pipeline Company's machines tore through more sacred indigenous land. The experience of my friend being arrested, I was also arrested, seeing people get dragged out of teepees, seeing people get shot at with rubber bullets, seeing images that refracted a history of violence right in front of me. All of that was extremely traumatizing. I remember leaving Setting Rock that second time and going out with friends and talking about what had happened and explaining things and kind of being lost in thought when the conversation changed, and realizing that I was disassociating, realizing that standing on a regular street corner and hearing the faint memory of screams from a protest or people being dragged out of teepees or people being tackled, that was a sign of the trauma that I experienced. I was moving through these layers and waves of what I now understand to be PTSD. And it made me angry. It made me cynical. It made me question my own mortality. And meanwhile, the politicians, Obama, the government, still can't stand up for indigenous people, still can't stop this pipeline from happening, still can't protect and institute policies that respect indigenous sovereignty. And it seems so wild to me that so many people were saying, vote, vote, worry about this, worry about the national stage, worry about national policy. And I thought a movement is happening right here where people are resisting what America is and what America represents. I was actually there when I learned that Donald Trump was going to be president. And all of this is to say that I think if I didn't have the experience of going to Standing Rock and witnessing an autonomous political space where the rules of this empire didn't matter as much, that the election year sadness and confusion and chaos would have probably bothered me a lot more. I wouldn't have had as many constructive spaces to radically imagine what it would be like to resist empire, because I didn't have to imagine it anymore. I was doing it alongside other people that knew what we were doing was right. Um, and that really was a period of time where no one could really talk to me and say, you need to vote for Hillary because Trump is bad, or you need to do this or that, because I'd already been chewed up through these jobs where I was paid to do social justice work and I was being mistreated, or I didn't have a say in my working conditions. I worked for a super PAC where we gathered data through canvassing, and I was like, where is this data going? And lo and behold, 4 years later, Tom Steyer, who owned that super PAC, would run for president. Around that time, I also disrupted a Bill Clinton speech because I was so angry about his history as someone that pushed for the 1994 crime bill, which would disproportionately impact poor Black and brown communities and send people from those communities to jail and prison. When I disrupted that speech, I had friends say that they were going to do it with me, and they didn't. And this was a period of time where I really kept thinking, if this system can produce so much evil and we procrastinate so much of the possibility of our antagonism, does that not mean we just spend the rest of our lives in this system, that things don't change as much as they could, that the needle isn't pushed further? And this began to instill in me this idea that as much as any kind of participation I could have in the mainstream system, as much value as that could have, there is so much more value in resisting the reformations of a political and economic system that disenfranchises people, that tears through their land, that erases their culture, that murders them and then villainizes them, that lies about what progress is. And instead, we should maybe be more concerned with being ungovernable, with creating alternatives, with showing each other that resisting the violences that are against us and against other people, that we don't have to wait for a future scenario to do it. It's possible now. A two-party system that gives us the illusion of choice. And in naming this evil, in naming the ways that our political government doesn't take care of us, in naming the ways that identity can be reduced and weaponized during electoral seasons, in naming the ways that our relationship to voting, based on your identity and your context and your background and your history, our connection to voting has reshaped again and again throughout history, because whether or not we have the right to vote, there has still been systems and processes of violence and evil against us. And if voting can't save us from these processes and systems of violence under the political system as we know it, we can either change our political course of action, or we can begin to criticize the political system as we know it, or do both and use that as a vehicle, as a path towards a better world. And when I think about different ways that we can imagine a meaningful politicized life, how can we deepen our relationship with mass incarceration through having actual relationships with people that are currently locked up? There are organizations and groups like In the Belly or Study and Struggle that offer curriculum and political education to people that are currently experiencing incarceration. There are organizations that offer funds and money towards those that are locked up. Politics of Innocence by Jackie Wang that argue against rationales that demand that someone be innocent in order to be freed from the ravages of police and prison system. Finding the capacity to be antagonistic towards these systems at play that are trying to denigrate people, that are trying to repress dissent. If we don't even articulate our desire or ability or our righteous need to be antagonistic towards these systems, any form of dissent or protest that we resort to can easily be considered unpatriotic, can easily be considered unproductive or uncivilized based off of the narrative or the logic of the state. I just want to end off this video kind of reiterating where I stand in terms of voting once again. I am definitely someone that when I engage with people, I'm not looking for someone to tell me a list of political realities or ideas that align with mine. I'm looking for a real conversation, both around the reasons that people vote and around the very real danger and harms of a two-party system, of the illusion of choice, and the ways that choosing the lesser evil just continues us in this process of assimilation and procrastination of what actually needs to be done, which is shutting shit down. And when I talk to people, I really hunger for that space where where I can maybe speak to someone and they can say, all of the anxiety and the things that a Trump presidency might represent, it actually really does bother me. I want my anxiety and whatever it may be to also be a part of dismantling the systems that are against poor Black and brown communities, that target people that come to this country in hopes of the American dream. And in this overall conversation about anti-voting, are we voting or participating in the political realm because we believe in the American dream, we believe in a better version of America? Or can we finally admit that there probably is no better version of America, because as long as America has existed, it has only pushed back against righteous dissent. It has only found ways to profit off of misery, off of the exploitation of the poor or the enslaved, and how our inability to imagine a reality outside of the American dream or the American nightmare will inevitably be what leads us towards not being able to oppose rising fascism. That leads us towards a reality where we believe we don't have the right to fight back or to express the realities of this system. And what I really, really just hope for is that regardless of who wins, we begin to have a process or a way of distancing ourselves from capitalism, from imperialism, from building out the structures and systems that allow us to self-govern or to take care of ourselves. And also we have the militancy to defend our communities and these organizations and processes that do help us, while the state or Americanism or imperialism will inevitably try to target us, as Quintel shows, as contemporary forms of repression shows. And if we can engage in a conversation next to voting that begins to attack all of those things, I would be more willing to engage in what electoralism represents. And I think the middle section of this video really breaks that down about how, especially in Black histories and spaces, the meaning of the vote has changed. And I think for the larger public, the meaning of the vote should also change based on the efficacy or lack thereof of our government, our political systems, and our politicians. I really hope this video helps folks that are really confused, that are conflicted during this electoral season, that it becomes like a sort of conversation starter for people. And let me know in the comments what you vibed with in this video, what you want to hear more of, or what other kind of political videos you'd want to see or hear next. Let's talk about my collaboration with Means TV. If you know me or my channel or any of the things that I post, you know that I'm dedicated to radical forms of media that question power, that question anti-Blackness, that dig into radical histories that are useful for audiences today while we're questioning the hellscape of the political life and world that we live under. And this is where Means TV is useful. It's a worker-owned cooperative, and it's the first anti-capitalist streaming service out there. And what this means is that the people that share their videos, post their films and documentaries on Means TV, as opposed to certain platforms like YouTube. And if you want to support the project of Means TV, signing up at the link in my description is one of the best ways you can do this, by signing up at that link. So if you'd like to support me or my channel, or get access to an amazing streaming service, check out the link in my description. That will be in this video and all of my other videos to get access to my exclusive link to sign up for Means TV at 20% off. Check out the link in my bio, and happy watching. You can now find Prince Shakur on Means TV, the home for worker-owned entertainment.